The sky over Asgard is on fire, not with lightning, not with the Bifrost, with a scream. A Valkyrie squadron lies scattered across the shattered rooftops of the Golden Hall, their wings broken, their spears buried in stone they were never meant to touch. And standing in the crater where the throne room used to be, green light pouring off him like a second sun, is something Odin has no name for. He doesn't ask what he's stepped into. He doesn't care whose realm this is. Somewhere between the stars, something hurt Broly one time too many, and the multiverse cracked open and dropped him here instead. Kratos has fought gods. Kratos has fought titans. Kratos has never fought this. This is Multiverse Saiyan, and this is What If Broly Entered God of War. Sam palms back behind the pen for this one, and if there's a crossover eating at you, a fight you need to see collide, drop it in the comments. This channel exists because you keep asking what if. Smash that like, ring the bell, subscribe if you're new, because Ragnarök just got a lot more complicated. There are stories the Aesir tell only when the mead runs low and the fire burns to embers. Stories of things that came before the gods and things that might come after. The sky would split, and every soul in the 9 realms would know the day their world ended. That was the prophecy the Aesir had spent generations bracing against. Nothing had prepared them for a sky that split early, and for something that owed no allegiance to any of the old songs. It began as a tear of light no wider than a blade's edge, hanging above the eastern ridge beyond Asgard's outer wall. A wrongness in the air that made the wind itself curdle in reverse, blowing inward toward the wound instead of away from it. The Valkyrie patrol saw it first. Air felt it before she saw it. A pressure behind her eyes, a weight settling on her chest like the air before lightning, except the storm this time had no clouds. She raised a hand, and her squadron of 6 fell into formation behind her on their carved stone perch, wings folded tight, spears angled low. "That is not the Bifrost," said Hala, youngest of the 6, her voice thinner than she meant it to be. "That is not any door I know." Aer did not answer. She was watching the tear widen, not tearing like cloth, not cracking like ice, but unfolding, the way a wound opens when something on the other side pushes against it from within. And then, with no more warning than a held breath finally released, something came through. It did not fall. It did not stumble, disoriented, into an unfamiliar sky the way lost things usually do. It simply arrived, already whole, already furious. A green-white blaze of light dropping out of the tear like a second sun had decided to be born directly above Asgard's eastern wall, and the shockwave of its arrival alone cracked the ridge stone beneath the Valkyrie's perch into 3 clean pieces. Ear's wings caught the blast wind and held. 2 of her squadron were not so fast. She heard Hala's cry cut short as the girl was thrown backward off the ridge, spear spinning end over end into the dark. When the light dimmed enough to look at directly, Aer understood, with the particular clarity that comes only in the seconds before something terrible, that the prophecy had never accounted for this. He was enormous, taller than any Jotun she had faced, taller even than the stories told of the frost giants of old Jotunheim, though his build was nothing like their rangy, ancient bulk. This was muscle stacked on muscle, coiled and overfull, as if his own body had been built to contain something too large for it, and had simply kept growing to try to fit. His hair stood on end, a wild teal-green crown that seemed to move with its own current, unrelated to the wind. His skin carried a faint green undercast beneath old scarring, and where his eyes should have shown color, there was only blank, merciless white. The eyes of something that had stopped seeing the world as anything but an obstacle, a very long time ago. He did not speak. He did not look around, did not take in the strange stone architecture, or the unfamiliar sky, or the 6 winged warriors staring up at him in open shock. He simply rolled one shoulder, as if working out a stiffness that had followed him across the boundary between realities, and green-white energy sheeted off his skin in a corona that blistered the frost off the nearby stone. Air raised her spear. "Identify yourself." Her Aesir-trained voice carried the old command cadence, the one meant for rogue Draugr and wayward giants, and anything else that crossed into Asgard's sky uninvited. It had worked, more or less, for a very long time. It did not work now. He turned his head toward her, slow, almost bored, and the pressure in the air doubled, then tripled, an invisible hand pressing down on the ridge itself. Two of her remaining squadrons staggered under it, wings buckling. Aer held her footing through sheer will and years of discipline, but she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, the cold certainty that her spear was a child's toy in the face of what stood before her. "I said," she began again. He answered with motion instead of words. One step forward, and the ridge stone beneath his foot didn't crack. It vaporized, a perfect circle of scorched nothing, where solid granite had been a heartbeat before. The remaining Valkyries scattered on instinct, and Aer barked the only order that made sense. "Fall back. Signal the Aesir court. Do not engage alone." She should have known that "do not engage alone" would not save the two who hesitated a moment too long. What happened next did not last more than 4 or 5 seconds by any measure Aer could later give an accounting of, and yet she would spend years afterward trying to compress it into words and never quite managing it. He moved, not fast in the way a trained warrior moves fast, calculated and economical, but fast in the way a landslide is fast, an event more than an action. And where he moved, the ridge did not survive. Sten, her second, tried to bring his spear up in a defensive arc that had turned aside frost giant clubs and Draugr claws alike. The spear did not break. It simply ceased to be relevant, along with a 15-foot section of the ridge behind Sten, which folded into a crater, as if a god's fist had come down, instead of a Saiyan's forearm. Sten lived, barely. He would not fly again for the better part of a year. Aer gathered what remained of her squadron, 4 now, 1 broken-winged and being half-carried, and did the hardest thing a Valkyrie commander can do. She called the retreat, and she meant it. There was no glory in this. There was no honor duel to be salvaged from a creature that had leveled solid stone with the back of an idle hand. There was only the truth every soldier learns eventually, that sometimes the correct response to overwhelming force is to survive long enough to tell someone with more power than you what you saw. By the time Aer's report reached the Aesir court, the eastern ridge had already lost another quarter-mile of stone, not through malice but through what could only be described as impatience, the stranger pacing in slow, heavy circles, his energy cracking the ground with every step, as though his body could not hold its own output still even at rest. Freya was the one who received the report first, in the war room beneath the palace where old maps of the 9 realms hung alongside newer ones charting the movements of giants and the slow gathering dread of Ragnarok's approach. She listened to Aer's account without interrupting. The tear of light, the arrival, the vaporized stone, Sten's ruined wing. And when it was done, she asked only one question. Did it speak? No, Lady Freya. Not a word. Freya's jaw tightened. In her long life she had negotiated with giants who hated her, bargained with dwarves who trusted no one, and once talked a rampaging Draugr horde into a temporary truce through nothing but patience and careful words. Something that could not be spoken to was a different category of problem entirely, closer to weather than to war. "Get me Kratos," she said. He was already halfway to the eastern ridge before the messenger reached him, drawn by a tremor he'd felt through the ground itself, a shudder that didn't match any of the seismic signatures Sindri had catalogued for this stretch of Midgard's border with Asgard. Kratos had lived through enough impossible things, titans, gods, his own father's rage-given form, that his instinct for wrong had been honed past subtlety. This felt wrong in a way that reminded him, uncomfortably, of the early days on Olympus, when a power he hadn't yet learned to measure had first announced itself by breaking something that should not have broken. Atreus caught up to him at the ridge trail, bow already strung. Sindri says whatever it is, it's still going. The ridge is half gone. Then we do not wait for it to finish. They crested the final rise together and found the ruin Air had described made real. A scorched crater where stone had been, a wide arc of destruction radiating outward from a single point, and at the center of it, still pacing in that slow, restless circle, the source of it all. Broly stopped. For the first time since his arrival, his head turned fully toward something and stayed turned. Kratos felt it, the shift in the air, the way the pressure that had been radiating outward in all directions suddenly gathered and focused, like a storm choosing a single point to strike. Broly's blank white eyes fixed on him, and something in that ancient, endless rage seemed, for just a moment, to recognize an equal. Atreus. Kratos did not take his eyes off the Saiyan. Get back. Father. Now. Atreus retreated to the ridge's edge, bow still raised, closer than his father wanted, but not so close he could argue the boy down without losing the seconds that mattered. Kratos rolled the Leviathan axe once in his grip, felt the familiar cold bite of the frost runes waking along the blade in answer to the tension building in his chest, and planted his feet. Broly did not roar. He did not announce himself, did not demand tribute or explanation, did not do any of the things gods and giants alike tended to do before a fight. The posturing, the naming, the ritual of violence that even monsters usually observed. He simply closed the distance between them in a single bound that cratered the ground on takeoff and landing both, and brought a fist down toward Kratos with the casual, world-ending indifference of something that had never once needed to hold back. Kratos got the Guardian shield up a half-second before impact. The blast of the collision threw him backward 40 feet, gouged a furrow through what remained of the ridge, and cracked the shield's rim in a way 3 years of fighting Baldur and the armies of Asgard combined had never managed. He came up out of the impact skidding, boots tearing new grooves into the stone, axe already swinging up into a defensive arc more from instinct than plan. Broly was already there to meet it. The frost rune blade caught the edge of the Saiyan's forearm and held. Didn't shatter. Didn't glance uselessly off invulnerable skin the way Kratos had half feared it might, but bit, drawing a thin line of green-tinged blood, and a flicker, just a flicker, of something that might have been surprise crossing that otherwise merciless white gaze. It was the first mark anything in this realm had managed to leave on him. It also seemed to make him angrier. The next several exchanges happened too fast for Atreus to track from the ridge, bow drawn but no clear shot presenting itself through the blur of green light and blue frost fire. Kratos fought the way he always fought, economical, reading for openings, using the Leviathan axe's throw and recall to strike from angles Broly's raw power couldn't anticipate. And for the first time in a long time, he was not winning. He was surviving, which was its own kind of victory against something like this. But every block sent shudders up through his bones that even the god of war's considerable frame wasn't built to absorb indefinitely. Freya arrived at the ridge as the fight tore a new crater into what remained of the eastern approach, her cider already gathering at her fingertips, assessing in the half-second she had before deciding how, or whether, to intervene. What she saw was not a battle she recognized from any of the old sagas. This was something closer to two forces of nature colliding, and she understood, with the particular dread of someone who has survived a very long time by knowing when a fight is unwinnable through force alone, that Kratos would not be ending this one with his axe. "Kratos!" she called out, cider crackling defensively around her as she moved to the ridge's edge. "Fall back. We need to understand what this is before it kills someone." Whether Kratos heard her, or simply reached the same conclusion through the language of his own battered ribs, he broke from the exchange with a hard downward strike of the axe that bought him distance, throwing himself backward into a roll that put 15 feet of scorched stone between himself and the Saiyan's next blow. Broly did not immediately pursue. He stood in the crater's center, blood, green-tinged, strange, trickling from the cut along his forearm, and for the first time since crossing into this world, he looked almost curious, staring at the wound, as though he could not quite recall the last time something had managed to make him bleed. It was, Freya would later reflect, the most dangerous kind of curiosity there was, the kind that made a thing want to test whether the wound had been luck, or whether it meant it had finally found something worth fighting properly. Kratos straightened, chest heaving, axe held low and ready, and met that terrible white gaze across the ruined ground between them. Neither of them had answers yet. Not for who this was. Not for what had torn a hole in the sky above Asgard. Not for how a fight against something with no name and no words would end. But both of them understood, in the wordless language shared by things built for war, that this was only the opening exchange of something far larger. Above them, the tear in the sky that had brought Broly through had not closed. It pulsed, faint and steady, like a wound that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to heal. They did not fight again that night, though it was not peace that stopped them. It was Freya, and the particular kind of stubbornness that had kept her alive through centuries of realms that wanted her dead. She had thrown herself into the gap between them the instant Kratos broke from the exchange, cider blazing at both hands, not aimed as a weapon but woven outward into the oldest working she knew, a binding ward, the kind used on rampaging Draugr and berserk giants when killing them would cost more than it solved. It would not have held a fraction of Broly's strength if he'd chosen to push through it. For 3 long seconds, as the green-white light of him strained visibly against the pale gold lattice of her cider, she genuinely believed it wouldn't. Then, inexplicably, he stopped pushing. Not because the ward had won. Freya understood that immediately, felt it in the way the pressure against her working simply, receded rather than broke. He had chosen to stop, the way an avalanche might pause mid-slide if something briefly more interesting caught its attention. His blank white eyes had drifted, in the space of that held breath, from Kratos to the wound on his own forearm, to the ward's shimmering gold light, to the strange sky and stranger stone architecture around him, and something in the flat, endless fury behind those eyes had shifted, however briefly, into something almost like assessment. He turned and walked away from the ridge, unhurried, footsteps still cratering stone with every stride, and did not look back. Freya did not lower the ward until he was 3 ridgelines distant. Even then, her hands shook. The war room beneath the Aesir Palace held more people that night than it had in the months since Baldur's death. Freya, Kratos, Atreus, Sindri fussing over Kratos' cracked shield with barely restrained panic, Brock muttering that he'd need 3 days and better ore than he currently had to even start patching that kind of damage, and Aer standing rigid near the door, her account of the initial encounter already given twice and requested a 3rd time by Aesir elders who could not quite believe what they were hearing. "He bled," Kratos said, when the room's noise finally settled enough for him to be heard. "That is the only thing I know for certain. The axe cut him. Nothing else I threw at him did more than make him angry. Bleeding is not weakness," Freya said. "I've seen giants bleed and keep fighting for another hour without slowing. What matters is that he stopped. Something in him chose not to finish that fight, and I want to know why, because I do not believe it was mercy." "It wasn't mercy," Atreus said quietly. Every head in the room turned toward him. He'd been unusually still since the ridge, turning something over that had nothing to do with sagas or runes. When he looked at the ward, right before he backed off, he didn't look afraid of it. He looked at it the way you look at something you don't understand yet, like he was curious what it was, not whether it could hurt him. Freya considered that, and did not like where it led. Then we may only have bought ourselves the time it takes for that curiosity to run out. Sindri, still cataloging the shield's cracked rim with a jeweler's precision even in the middle of a strategic crisis, spoke up without looking away from his work. "For what it's worth, whatever put that gash in him wasn't the axe's edge alone. There's frost scarring at the wound site. The runes bit into him, not just the metal." He glanced up. "That matters. means the enchantment itself is doing something his skin can't just shrug off. Kratos turned that over. Then it is not invulnerable to everything, only to force. Or, Freya said slowly, to force it expects. A being like this has likely spent its whole existence fighting things that hit harder, not things that hit differently. Cold, that isn't just cold. Magic, that isn't just another kind of punch. It was Aer, still standing near the door, who asked the question no one else had voiced yet. Lady Freya, what is it? Not how do we fight it, what is it? Because I have hunted giants, and Draugr, and once helped put down a rogue dweller from Svartalfheim that had gone mad with grief. I have never seen anything look at the world the way that thing looks at the world. There was no cruelty in it, no hate even, not really. Just hunger for something to push against. Nobody in the room had an answer for that. It was Freya, eventually, who offered the closest thing to one. In my centuries, I have met beings driven by conquest, by grief, by prophecy, by hunger for power. I have never met one driven by nothing at all but the need to release something too large to be held quietly. That is not evil in the way we usually name it. That is something closer to a wound that has never been allowed to close. The room sat with that a moment. Then Brock, never one to let silence sit too long, grunted. Wound or not, it's about to level half of Asgard's eastern approach if somebody doesn't figure out how to talk to the damn thing, or fight it properly, and soon. They found him 2 days later, not because he had come looking for them, but because the trail of scorched ground and shattered stone leading away from the eastern ridge had not stopped, had in fact widened into a slow, methodical arc of destruction across the wilder stretches of Midgard's border realms, as though he were testing the limits of every rock formation and frozen lake he came across, simply to see what would give. He had found a herd of frost wolves near the edge of Jotunheim's old borders, descendants of the war beasts that once ran with the Jotnar armies, feral now and territorial, easily capable of tearing apart an unwary traveler. Kratos and Atreus arrived to find the pack scattered and fleeing, tails low, giving Broly's clearing a wide and permanent berth, while the Saiyan himself stood motionless at the center of a circle of frozen, cratered ground, staring up at the pale winter sky with an expression that Atreus, watching from the ridge above, could only describe afterward as lost. He's not hunting, Atreus said, low. He's not doing anything. He's just standing there. Freya, who had insisted on joining this approach despite Kratos' reluctance, studied the stillness with the same careful attention she gave any unfamiliar working of magic. That's not calm, she said finally. That's the eye of something. I don't like it. She was right to not like it. The moment their approach carried them close enough for Broly to register, and it was not sound or sight that alerted him, Freya noted with a chill, but something more like a pressure change, an awareness of power nearby that didn't need eyes to locate. His stillness broke instantly into motion, and the low, simmering aura around him surged from ember to inferno in less than a heartbeat. This time, Freya did not wait for the fight to escalate before acting. She stepped forward past Kratos, both hands raised, cider already weaving outward. Not a ward this time, not a binding, but something older and more delicate, a working meant to speak across barriers of language and mind alike, used centuries ago to parley with giants whose tongues no Aesir could translate. I am not here to fight you, she said, letting the satyr carry the meaning of the words outward, even as she spoke them aloud, layering intent into the working itself. I want to understand what happened to you. For a long moment, nothing changed. The aura around Broly did not recede, his blank white eyes fixed on her with the same merciless assessment he'd given the ward 2 nights prior. Then, for the first time since his arrival in this world, he spoke. His voice was low, cracked, unused in a way that suggested it had been a very long time since he'd had reason to form words rather than simply act. And what came out was not a threat, not a demand, but a single, flat statement, that seemed to have been dragged up from somewhere far beneath the rage that usually occupied the front of him. "Everyone always wants something from me," the satyr working faltered in Freya's hands, not from any counter-magic, but from the sheer unexpected weight of the words themselves. She recovered quickly, keeping her voice level, her hands steady. "I don't want anything from you. I want to know why you're here, why the sky tore open above my home and put you in it. I didn't choose this place." His aura pulsed, a flare of green-white light that scorched frost off the nearby stone. "I don't choose anything. I just end up places. And then something always finds a reason to come after me. Some god, some army, some brother who was supposed to protect me, and instead..." The words cut off, sharp, as though he'd caught himself saying more than he meant to. The aura flared higher, a warning. Kratos, silent until now, understood something in that half-sentence that struck closer to home than he expected. He had spent years being hunted for what he was, rather than what he'd chosen to become, by gods who feared his strength, by prophecies that named him a destroyer, before he'd done anything to earn it. He knew the particular exhaustion of a world that only ever approached with a spear in one hand. "No one here has decided what you are yet," Kratos said, his voice low but carrying. "That is more than I can say for the world I came from, when it looked at me the same way you're looking at us now." Broly's gaze shifted to him, and for the first time, the flat white fury in his eyes seemed to catch, however briefly, on something like recognition. Not trust, not yet, but a flicker of the same wary, exhausted watchfulness that Kratos himself had worn for most of his life. It didn't last. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the frozen clearing, a horn sounded. The deep, resonant call of an Aesir war horn, signaling a scouting party that had followed Freya's group without her sanction, drawn by rumors of the destruction at the eastern ridge, and eager to prove themselves against the threat everyone in Asgard was now whispering about. Broly's head snapped toward the sound. The fragile stillness shattered. "See?" he said, voice dropping to something low and terrible. "Always something." The aura around him detonated outward, and the frozen clearing became a battlefield again. Not against Kratos this time, not against Freya, but against the approaching scouting party who had no idea what they were riding toward, and no way to know that their timing had just cost the realm its first and best chance at understanding what, exactly, had been dropped into their war. Kratos swore under his breath and moved to intercept, axe already in hand, Atreus's bow already drawn behind him. Freya's satyr flared back to defensive readiness. The fragile thread of communication she'd spent precious minutes weaving now snapped clean through. Whatever Broly had almost been willing to say, whatever door had briefly cracked open in that frozen clearing, slammed shut behind a wall of green-white fire, and the second collision of the war had already begun. The Aesir scouts numbered 11, young, eager, and led by a warrior named Torvald who had spent the last 2 days hearing second-hand accounts of the Eastern Ridge's destruction and convincing himself, the way young warriors often do, that the stories had to be exaggerated. 11 trained spears against one creature, however strange, seemed to him a fair accounting. He would understand, within the first 10 seconds of the engagement, exactly how wrong that math had been. Broly did not wait for them to form ranks. He met the horn's call the way he met every summons this world had offered him so far. Not with words, not with challenge, but with immediate, overwhelming force, closing the distance to the lead riders in a single bound that sent a shockwave rippling through the frozen ground and threw 3 horses from their feet before a single blade had been drawn. Kratos reached the edge of the clearing a heartbeat later, and what he saw confirmed the fear that had been building in his chest since the ridge. This was not a fight that could be won by adding more bodies to the count. Broly moved through the scouting party the way a wildfire moves through dry brush, not with cruelty exactly, Freya's earlier assessment holding true even here, but with a complete absence of restraint that made cruelty almost beside the point. A backhand meant to clear a path sent 2 riders and their mounts 30 feet through the air. A stamped foot, meant only to steady his footing, cracked the frozen ground into a spiderweb of fissures that swallowed a third rider's horse to the fetlocks and nearly took the rider's leg with it. Fall back. Torvald was screaming it now, all his earlier confidence gone, dragging a fallen comrade up by the collar, even as green-white light seared past his shoulder close enough to singe his hair. Fall back. Kratos didn't have time to reach them cleanly. He threw the Leviathan axe in a hard, flat arc, not at Broly directly, but at the ground between the Saiyan and the scattering riders. The frost rune impact detonating outward in a wall of jagged ice that bought 2, maybe 3 seconds of hesitation. It was enough. Atreus's arrows followed a half-breath later, not aimed to wound but to distract. 3 shafts of sonic arrow force cracking against Broly's shoulder and drawing his attention, however briefly, away from the fleeing scouts. It was the wrong kind of attention to draw. Broly turned toward the ridge where Atreus stood, and for the first time since his arrival, something in his blank white gaze sharpened into something that looked almost like decision, as though the boy with the bow had, in that instant, become the newest entry on a very long list of things that had decided to test him. A curious move, Kratos' voice cracked across the clearing, and he was already running, already knowing with sick certainty that running would not be fast enough. It was Freya who closed the gap instead. She'd held back through the opening exchange, gathering the deepest reserve of cider she dared risk, and now she threw all of it forward in a single working. Not a ward this time, not a binding, but a raw wall of frozen force meant to do one thing only: buy a body's width of space between Broly and the boy on the ridge. The wall held for less than 2 seconds. It was, Freya would reflect later, the most expensive 2 seconds of her life. The backlash of the shattering ward drove her to one knee, blood at her lip, vision swimming. But it was enough for Atreus to throw himself sideways off the ridge's edge, tumbling down the frozen slope as the space he'd occupied a heartbeat earlier erupted into a crater of scorched stone and ice. Kratos reached the ridge as his son hit the bottom of the slope, rolling, already scrambling back up with more anger than fear on his face. A Spartan reflex bred into him despite everything Kratos had tried to temper it with. "I'm fine," Atreus started. "You are not fighting him again," Kratos said, low and absolute, hauling his son up by the arm and putting himself bodily between Atreus and the clearing. Not today. Above them, Broly had stopped his advance, not out of restraint, but because Freya's collapsed working had left a lingering discharge of raw cider crackling across the crater's edge, and something in that unfamiliar magic seemed to actually give him pause in a way physical force never had. He stood at the crater's rim, chest heaving, green-white aura flickering unevenly for the first time since his arrival, as though even his boundless reserve had limits when pushed hard enough in rapid succession. It was, Kratos realized in that pause, the first real opening they'd had. He didn't take it as an attack. He'd spent enough of his life learning, too slowly and at too great a cost, that not every opening was meant for a blade. Instead, he stood his ground at the crater's far edge, axe lowered but not sheathed, and said the only thing he could think to say that might land where Freya's parley attempt had been interrupted. "They ran," Kratos said, nodding toward the scattered, retreating scouts, most of them already well clear of the clearing, dragging their wounded with them. "You could have finished them. You didn't." Broly's aura flickered again, uneven, and his blank eyes fixed on Kratos, with something that was not quite calculation, and not quite exhaustion, but sat somewhere uneasily between the two. "They ran because they were scared," he said, voice still low, still cracked from disuse. "Everyone runs eventually. Or they don't run, and then—" He didn't finish the sentence. His hand, Kratos noticed, had curled into a fist at his side, knuckles pale even against the strange green undercast of his skin. "And then what?" Kratos said. Not a challenge, almost despite himself, something closer to a genuine question. For a long moment, the only sound in the clearing was the wind, and the distant, retreating hoofbeats of the scouting party, and the faint, uneven crackle of Broly's aura struggling to settle back into its usual restless simmer. When he finally answered, his voice had dropped lower still, and something in it carried a weight that made even Atreus, still catching his breath at the base of the ridge, go quiet. And then I stopped being able to tell the difference, Broly said, between the ones trying to kill me and the ones just standing too close. Freya, still kneeling where the backlash had dropped her, forced herself upright, cider-drained hands shaking at her sides, and understood, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, exactly what she was looking at. Not a monster. Not even really a weapon, though the world had likely used him as one more times than he could count. Something closer to a wound that had been struck so many times, by so many hands, that it had stopped being able to distinguish a threat from a touch. That is not a fight we can win by hitting harder, she said quietly, to Kratos, though her eyes stayed on Broly. That's not a fight at all. That's a door someone needs to find a way to open without getting their hand taken off in the process. Kratos didn't answer immediately. He was thinking of Ares, of Zeus, of every god who had looked at his rage and decided the only sensible response was more force, more punishment, more reasons to keep raging, and how none of it had ever actually stopped him, not until something else, something slower and harder to name, had finally reached him instead. "We are not going to hurt you," Kratos said finally, to Broly directly. "Not today, not unless you force it." Broly's aura pulsed once, sharp, old suspicion, old pattern, the promise before every betrayal he'd apparently learned to expect. "That's what they all say." "I know," Kratos said. "I have said it myself, to people who did not deserve to hear it from me. That does not mean it stops being true." It was, perhaps, the least mythic exchange the sagas would ever record of this war. No clash of blades, no thunder of prophecy, just two exhausted, battle-worn things looking at each other across a crater's edge, and finding, for the first time, a shared language that had nothing to do with violence. It did not resolve anything. Broly's aura did not fully settle. He did not lower his guard, did not step forward in trust, did not offer anything so simple as an alliance, but he did not attack again. And when, an hour later, the Aesir Court's Emergency Council convened to demand a response to the scouting party's mauling, casualties reported, though thankfully none fatal, thanks to Freya's intervention, it was Kratos of all people, who stood before Odin's assembled advisors and argued, against every instinct the realm's long history of fighting monsters had trained into them, for patience instead of an army. "You want to send soldiers against something that broke 11 of your best scouts without trying," Kratos said, flat, unimpressed by the war drums some of the younger Aesir lords were already beating. "You will lose more than scouts. I have fought him twice now. Force does not work on him. It only confirms what he already believes about this world." "And what does it believe?" Odin's voice, tired and ancient, carried across the war room's tense silence. "That everyone who comes near him wants something from him, or wants him dead," Kratos said. "So far, this realm has done nothing to prove otherwise." The council did not agree easily. Old fears ran deep, and the memory of the Eastern Ridge's destruction was not one that faded quickly from Aesir minds. But in the end, grudgingly, a fragile plan took shape. No army, not yet. A single approach, carefully staged, offering something the realm had not yet tried. Not a weapon, not a ward, something closer to the thing Broly himself had named without meaning to, a door, offered without a spear behind it, and the very real risk of what happened if that offer was refused. Above the war room, unseen by any of them, the tear in the sky that had first delivered Broly into this world still pulsed faintly against the darkening clouds, patient, unclosed, and utterly indifferent to whether the realm below found a way to reach the storm it had inherited, before that storm decided, once and for all, that reaching back was a mercy it could no longer afford to believe in. The plan they settled on had no precedent in Aesir memory, and half the war room objected to it on those grounds alone. No warband, no show of force, a single approach. Freya, Kratos, and Atreus, unarmored beyond what any traveler might carry, walking into whatever clearing or crater Broly currently occupied, carrying nothing that could be mistaken for a weapon raised in threat. "If this fails," Odin had said, voice heavy with the weight of a ruler who had already lost too much to Ragnarok's slow approach, "it will cost us 3 of our strongest, and I will have handed the realm's enemies its finest weapon on a plate." "If it fails," Freya had answered, "we were never going to win this any other way regardless." They found him 3 valleys north of the frozen clearing, in a stretch of wilderness untouched by settlement, where the destruction he left in his wake, cratered stone, scorched frost, the occasional felled tree split clean through, had begun to form its own kind of trail, a map of a creature testing the edges of a world that hadn't yet given him a reason to stop. He was not attacking anything when they found him. He was simply standing at the edge of a frozen lake, staring down at his own reflection in the ice, with an expression Atreus, watching from the tree line, would later describe as the loneliest thing he'd ever seen. Freya went first, alone, the way they'd agreed. Kratos and Atreus holding back at the tree line, visible but not crowding. A visible restraint that was, in its own way, the entire point. "We're not here to fight you," she said again, the same words she'd offered before the horn's interruption had shattered their first attempt. "And this time, no one is going to sound a horn to prove me a liar." Broly's aura flickered, wary, but not immediately hostile, which itself was progress measured against where they'd started. "Everyone says that, right up until they don't. I can't promise you every soul in this realm will keep that promise," Freya said honestly. "I can promise the 3 of us standing here will. And I can promise you something else. Something no one else in whatever world you've been dropped through so far has apparently bothered to offer." She let the cedar fade fully from her hands, a deliberate, visible act of vulnerability. "A choice. You don't owe this realm anything. You didn't ask to fall through that tier. But if you want to stay somewhere that isn't actively hunting you, this realm has enough war coming already without needing you to be part of it against your will." For a long moment, Broly said nothing. His reflection in the frozen lake stared back up at him, unmoving, and something in his blank white eyes seemed to be turning her words over with the same wary suspicion he turned over everything. "You want something," he said finally. Not accusation this time, something closer to resignation, like a man checking a wound he already expects to find infected. "I want the same thing you probably want," Freya said, "for the next thing that finds you not to be another spear." It was Kratos who closed the remaining distance then, slow, deliberate, the Leviathan axe strapped visibly at his back rather than in hand, a choice that cost him something, given every instinct honed by years of war screaming at him to keep a weapon ready near something this dangerous. "I have spent most of my life being what the world decided I was before I had a chance to decide it myself," he said. "Rage before reason, weapon before man. It took longer than I am proud of to learn there was another way to be strong." He nodded toward Atreus, still hanging back at the tree line, watching. "I did not learn it alone, and I did not learn it from anyone who came at me with more force." Something in Broly's stance shifted. Not relaxation exactly. His aura never fully quieted through the entire exchange. A restless simmer that Freya suspected might never fully settle no matter what came next. But the coiled readiness to strike eased, fractionally, into something closer to simply standing. "I don't know how to be anything else," Broly said, and for the first time, the words carried less rage than something rawer beneath it. "I've tried. There were people who tried to help. It never." He stopped himself again, the way he had in the frozen clearing, catching some deeper wound before it could fully surface. "It doesn't have to work the first time," Kratos said. "It rarely does." The silence that followed was not peace exactly. Freya would later describe it to the council as the absence of active war rather than the presence of trust. But it held, unbroken, for longer than any exchange between Broly and this realm had held before. Long enough for Atreus to finally step forward from the tree line, slow, hands visibly empty, and for the first time address the Saiyan directly. "For what it's worth," Atreus said, "I've got a temper too. Runs in the family, I guess. It doesn't have to run everything, though, even when it feels like it might." Broly looked at him, really looked, the blank white fury behind his eyes cutting through the boy with an intensity that made Atreus hold his ground through sheer will rather than actual courage. And something almost like the ghost of understanding crossed his face before it was gone again, buried back beneath the restless simmer that seemed to be the only steady state his body knew. He did not agree to anything, not in words. There was no oath sworn, no formal alliance struck the way the sagas would later dramatize it. What happened instead was smaller, and in its own way, more significant. Broly turned from the lake's edge, looked out at the wilderness stretching north toward realms none of them had fully mapped, and said, in a voice quieter than anything he'd offered so far, "I'm not promising I won't hurt anyone." "No one's asking for a promise," Freya said. "Just a chance to prove the next attempt goes differently than the last few." It was, in the end, less a resolution than a fragile beginning, the tear in the sky above the eastern ridge finally sealing shut that same night, its purpose apparently served, leaving no way back to whatever world had produced the endless cycle of violence that had shaped Broly into what he'd become. Whether that closing door was mercy or another kind of trap, none of them could say for certain. What they could say, in the days that followed, was that the destruction stopped. The restless pacing continued, the aura never fully quieted, and there would be, all of them suspected, difficult days ahead. Moments where old instincts and older wounds would flare back up faster than patience could contain them. But for the first time since a green-white blaze had torn open the sky above Asgard, the realm had offered something other than a spear, and something other than a spear had, however cautiously, been accepted in return. The eastern ridge never fully recovered its old shape. The crater where Broly first arrived remained, weathered slowly by wind and frost into something the Aesir would eventually just call the Scar, a landmark on maps that hadn't existed a season before. Aer's squadron flew patrol near it sometimes, and reported, without quite being able to explain why, that the wreckage no longer felt like a wound. Just a place something difficult had happened, and then, slowly, hadn't happened again. Broly did not become a hero. He did not stand shoulder to shoulder with Kratos against whatever remained of Ragnarok's approach, did not swear oaths to Odin's court, or take up residence in Asgard's halls. He kept to the wilder valleys north of the ridge, alone more often than not, the restless simmer of his power never fully quiet. But when Freya visited, as she began to do, carrying nothing but conversation and the occasional patience-tested silence, he no longer answered her presence with immediate readiness for war. Kratos returned to his own long road, his own war still waiting, but carried something forward from that frozen lake he hadn't expected to find in a creature built from nothing but rage. A reminder, given back to him at a point in his life when he'd needed it more than he let on, that even the deepest wound could be met with something other than another blow. Whether the storm had truly passed, or simply learned to hold its breath, no one in Asgard could say for certain. But the sky stayed sealed, the Scar stayed quiet, and for now, that was enough.